She was a police captain on a secret mission until one wrong arrest on Oceanfront Boulevard turned her into a fugitive. Elise Monroe's story isn't just about betrayal, it's about how far the system will go to silence the truth. What happened next will leave you stunned. Hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more powerful true story dramas. Trust us, you don't want to miss this. The morning began like any other on Harbor Row sky painted soft blue, gulls circling above, and the sharp scent of salt and seaweed hanging in the air. At 6:15, the marina was already waking up, joggers pounding the boardwalk, vendors wheeling out carts, and tourists snapping selfies beneath palm trees strung with cafe lights that hadn't yet blinked off from the night before. Captain Elise Monroe laced up her running shoes just outside her small apartment near the pier. She wore gray compression leggings, a faded green tank top, and a zippered navy jacket tied around her waist. Her curly hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her earbuds played a soft rhythm to keep her pace steady. At 45 years old, Elise had earned her stripes the hard way through grit, brains, and an unflinching moral code. She wasn't just one of Pacific Harbor PD's highest-ranking officers, she was the leader of a covert task force targeting one of the most elusive smuggling rings operating through the city's ports. Today was Phase 3 of the operation surveillance of a suspect cargo vessel expected to dock shortly after sunrise. Her instructions were clear: stay in plain sight, avoid attention, and gather visuals. She had done this hundreds of times before. But this time, someone noticed her, and not the right someone. At 6:43, as Elise stretched against a metal bench near the edge of the dock, she spotted the ship. It was old and scarred, with chipped blue paint and faded numbers on the hull. A figure moved on deck fast, nervous, unloading boxes too quickly for a simple marina delivery. Elise's eyes narrowed. She reached for her phone to snap a picture. That's when a voice barked from behind her. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the bench." Elise turned slowly. Standing 3 feet away was Officer Kendra Walsh, young, tense, and radiating the false confidence of someone fresh out of academy training but already drunk on authority. Her sandy hair was pulled into a severe ponytail, her badge glinting in the early light. Her hand hovered just inches from the holstered weapon at her hip. "I'm fine, officer," Elise said calmly, "just stretching before a jog." Walsh took a step closer, eyes scanning Elise's outfit like it was a crime in itself. "There have been reports of theft in this area," she said sharply. "You match the description." Elise blinked. "I live nearby," she replied. "Check with dispatch. My name is Elise Monroe." Walsh's expression didn't budge. "Got ID?" Elise exhaled, her chest tightening. "Not on me. I'm undercover." She dropped her voice slightly, eyes steady. "I'm Captain Monroe, Pacific Harbor PD." That should have ended it. It didn't. Instead, Walsh smirked. "Captain, in joggers and a tank top. Cute story. Turn around, hands behind your back." Elise's pulse kicked. She stepped back instinctively. "You don't want to do this!" But it was too late. Walsh grabbed her wrist, twisted it behind her back, and shoved her face first against the cold boardwalk railing. The cuffs clicked shut with vicious precision. A small crowd began to gather, phones raised, whispers turning to gasps. A group of tourists on electric scooters stopped mid-ride. Someone pointed and laughed. "She's resisting," Walsh shouted unnecessarily. "We've got a suspect, possibly armed." Elise's voice sliced through the chaos. "I am Captain Elise Monroe. You're making a mistake." But her words were drowned out by Walsh's next shout. This one meant for show, not safety. "Thief, It echoed across the boardwalk like a gunshot. Gasps erupted. Phones kept filming. One woman gasped. "She doesn't look like a cop." A teenager muttered. "She fits the profile." Though, the shame was instant, hot, and suffocating. Elise stood, cuffed and helpless, as Officer Walsh yanked her backwards toward the patrol car. The cuffs bit into her wrists. Her muscles screamed from the awkward grip. Her heart pounded not from fear, but fury. At the squad car, Elise made one last plea. "Check with Sergeant Damian Hayes, badge number 5412, or Detective Keene. They'll confirm everything." Walsh rolled her eyes. "Sure, and I'm the chief of police." Elise was shoved into the back seat of the cruiser, knees slamming against the hard plastic divider. The car pulled away from the marina, and with it, the last thread of control Elise thought she still had. What should have been a simple surveillance run was now a PR nightmare, and worse, a major breach in operational security. By the time they reached the Pacific Harbor precinct, Elise's face and name were already flooding social media, clipped into 60-second videos, labeled "Thief in Custody," claims she's a captain, smells like a setup. Inside the station, the familiar hum of morning activity came to a screeching halt as Elise was marched past the bullpen. Eyes widened, a few jaws dropped. Sergeant Lewis Connors stood frozen by the coffee machine, his cup spilling over as recognition struck him. "Captain Monroe?" he asked. Stunned, Walsh stiffened. "You know her? She's your superior officer," Connors snapped. "What the hell have you done?" "But the damage was done." Elise sat in a holding cell, hands trembling, wrists sore, blood throbbing in her ears as the realization sank in. The suspect ship was gone. The operation was blown. Her identity. Her cover. Her entire case compromised by a rookie cop too biased or too proud to follow protocol. She leaned her head against the concrete wall, blinking back tears of rage. This wasn't just an arrest. It was the beginning of a war. And if you've made it this far, you already know Elise Monroe is not the kind of woman to go down quietly. Stay tuned. This is only the beginning. Like, comment, and subscribe, because the deeper we go, the darker it gets. By 7:30 that morning, Elise Monroe's face was everywhere. The video, less than 2 minutes long, was clipped, filtered, and captioned by strangers who knew nothing about her. It began with the sound of seagulls and ended with the sharp click of handcuffs. Her voice, measured and calm, was overlaid by Officer Kendra Walsh's barking commands and the final damning shout that echoed like a gunshot across Oceanfront Boulevard, "Thief!" The footage exploded on social media like fire over dry brush. By 8:15, it had been reposted over 30,000 times. By 9 o'clock, it was on the local news. And by 10, the national anchors were already asking, who is Elise Monroe, and why was she pretending to be a cop? Elise sat alone in a third-floor interrogation room, the linoleum cold beneath her feet, the fluorescent lights humming like a warning. Her wrists bore raw red bands from the cuffs Walsh had locked too tight. Her hair, once neatly tied back, had come loose in sweaty curls around her face. Her green tank top clung to her from the rough treatment. She looked, by every surface standard, exactly like what they had accused her of being, a suspect caught mid-crime. Except she wasn't. She was a captain. A decorated one. 18 years in the department, 8 commendations, 5 task force leadership citations. But in the eyes of the internet, and more dangerously, In the eyes of the criminal network she'd spent 7 months infiltrating, Elise Monroe was now exposed. She stared at the wall, jaw tight, heart hammering. She didn't fear embarrassment. She feared the collapse of everything she'd built. The cartel she was targeting, an international smuggling operation known as the Red Tide, watched social media closer than most federal agencies. They had eyes everywhere. If they saw that video, and they would her name, her face, her entire cover was torched. The door opened. In stepped Deputy Chief Marcus Wexler. He was all polished cruelty, sharp navy suit, silk tie, silver cufflinks that glinted with each exaggerated gesture. His face, clean-shaven and expressionless, gave nothing away. But Elise knew who he was underneath, a survivor of old guard politics, a master manipulator who'd built his career by exploiting chaos, not calming it. He shut the door quietly behind him and leaned against the edge of the table. "Well," he said, his voice like cold coffee, "this is quite the mess." Elise didn't flinch. "You've seen the footage." "I've seen the footage," he repeated, eyes narrowing. "So has every reporter in the state. So has the mayor. So has the DA's office. And probably half the Red Tide cartel." There it was, out loud. She looked him dead in the eye. "You know I was undercover. That operation was greenlit by Captain Hayes, signed off with your own initials 3 months ago. I had reason to be on that boardwalk. The only mistake made yesterday was by Officer Walsh." Wexler tilted his head. "Walsh is young." She followed instinct. She followed bias. Elise snapped, before she could stop herself. "And now we've handed our investigation to the cartel on a silver platter." A pause. Then Wexler leaned forward, his tone shifting. "The mayor wants heads. The city wants someone held accountable. The press is circling like vultures. And your face is front page by lunchtime. So here's what we're going to do." Elise braced herself. "I'm placing you on immediate administrative leave," he said flatly. "Effective 12 noon today. Pending an internal affairs investigation." Her jaw clenched. "You're suspending me?" "I'm removing you until this dies down," he said, as if that made it better. "You'll be temporarily relieved of duty and access. Turn in your badge, your firearm, your clearance codes. You're punishing me for being racially profiled by a rookie." "I'm protecting the department," he shot back. "From optics, from lawsuits, from the narrative that we allowed one of our own to impersonate a suspect in broad daylight and spark a viral scandal. Your intentions aren't in question. Your judgment is." "You mean your reputation is," Elise said, her voice cold. Another pause, a longer one. Wexler stood, adjusted his cuffs, then nodded to the corner, where an IA officer had appeared behind the mirrored glass. "Elise Monroe," he said, almost too formally now. "You are under departmental review for procedural violations, breach of undercover protocol, and potential interference in an open investigation. You'll be escorted to collect your personal belongings." She stared at him, fury coiled in her chest like a live wire. "You just gave the Red Tide a gift." He smiled faintly. "Then I suggest you spend your leave staying alive." With that, he turned and walked out. She sat frozen for a long moment, heart beating against her ribs. Her badge, the one she'd earned, bled for, defended, would be stripped in less than 10 minutes. Her operation was gone. Her name was radioactive. And the very people she was trying to bring down would now know exactly where to find her. Outside the room, as she was led down the hall by internal affairs, officers avoided her gaze. Some watched the floor, Others watched the overhead televisions, where the looped footage of her arrest played silently in the background. Her humiliation had become office wallpaper. By the time she reached her locker, word had fully spread. Sergeant Keene, a friend, one of the few who hadn't turned his back, stood nearby, jaw tight. "This is bull," he muttered under his breath as she emptied her locker. "You don't deserve this." Elise zipped up her duffel. "Doesn't matter if I deserve it. Wexler needed a scapegoat, and I walked right into it." Keene hesitated. "You still want to bring them down?" She met his eyes, more than ever, and with that, she walked out of the precinct, not as Captain Elise Monroe, decorated leader of the Pacific Harbor Undercover Division, but as a suspended officer with no badge, no cover, and a target now painted on her back. The streets outside buzzed with traffic, cameras, and murmurs. Posters with her face were already being printed. Commentators argued about her status. Protesters chanted both for her and against her. The city had chosen sides. But Elise, she wasn't done. Not even close. Subscribe for Part 3. It's about to get real. She had lost her badge, but not her mission. 3 days after her suspension, Elise Monroe sat in the driver's seat of her black SUV, parked under a crumbling overpass just outside downtown Pacific Harbor. Rain tapped softly against the windshield, matching the low, steady rhythm of her thoughts. The air was thick with salt and tension. Her world had unraveled in 72 hours an arrest, a viral scandal. And now, something worse. Silence from the very people who once called her captain. She tapped her fingers on the steering wheel. Something wasn't right. Something felt staged. When Elise had turned in her credentials, Internal Affairs hadn't just taken her badge, they'd impounded her vehicle. Standard procedure, they said. Just a formality. But when they returned it earlier that morning, the car wasn't just cleaner, it was wrong. The driver's seat had been adjusted forward by at least 5 inches. Her glove box was locked, though she never kept it that way. And her emergency first aid kit, always stocked in the back compartment, was missing. She popped the trunk and began a slow inspection. Her instincts screamed louder than ever. It didn't take long. Wedged deep inside the lining of her spare tire well was a tightly wrapped plastic pouch containing 1/2 pound of heroin. And not just any heroin, this batch was stamped with a red Tide symbol. The same mark the smuggling cartel used on all their shipments. Elise stared at it, jaw clenched, pulse racing. They were framing her, again. She didn't move for a full minute. Didn't curse, didn't panic. Just breathed, in and out. She reached for her burner phone, the one she hadn't turned on since the operation collapsed, and dialed a number she had memorized years ago. "Louise Moreau." The voice answered after 2 rings. "It's Monroe," she said, voice low. "They've planted something in my car. Where are you under the Eastway overpass? Bring gloves." And a camera. 27 minutes later. Detective Louise Moreau, stocky, quiet, fiercely loyal, pulled up in an unmarked sedan. He had been one of the few left in the department who still believed in her. Elise popped the trunk without a word. Moreau looked, whistled softly, then immediately reached for the evidence kit he always kept stashed in his trunk. "They're trying to bury you," he muttered as he snapped photos from every angle. "No," Elise said calmly. "They're trying to erase me." He looked up. "You think this goes all the way up?" She nodded once. "Wexler." The heroin wasn't all. In the glove box, now mysteriously unlocked. They found forged bank statements, account records, offshore transfers, deposits in Elise's name that she had never seen before, each neatly dated and linked to shell corporations in Barbados and Malta. A casual observer or an eager prosecutor would say the evidence was overwhelming. A captain, caught red-handed in the very web she was supposed to dismantle. But Elise knew better, and she knew who had likely slipped it all into place: Officer Kendra Walsh. She had motive. She had access. And after publicly arresting Elise on camera, she had incentive to protect her own fragile reputation. All she had to do was turn Elise into the villain and herself into the accidental hero who uncovered a dirty cop hiding in plain sight. That night, Elise met with civil rights attorney Gillian Cross at a quiet cafe near the harbor, an old friend from her days in the academy and one of the sharpest legal minds in the city. Gillian had represented whistleblowers, prosecutors, and survivors. But this case, was personal. They planted heroin and bank records, Gillian said. Voice sharp and controlled. Elise nodded. Monroe's got it documented. Photographs. Time-stamped. No fingerprints except mine. Of course, but the seat's been adjusted, and there's evidence someone else accessed my glove box. Gillian tapped her pen against her notepad. We'll need chain of custody documents, surveillance from the impound lot, and I want to subpoena Officer Walsh's radio logs and patrol reports. Elise met her gaze. You think we can fight this? Gillian leaned forward. I don't think. I know. But we have to move before they try something bigger. Elise exhaled, her hands trembling slightly. They already tried. I'm next in the narrative. What do you mean, they didn't just plant evidence? They're setting the scene. I was told earlier today that an anonymous tip has already been submitted to the department's oversight board. They're preparing to open a formal investigation. And once it begins, once it's official, I lose any shot at clearing my name before they make it permanent. Gillian's eyes narrowed. Then we need to hit first. The next 48 hours were a blur of motion. Elise and Monroe worked around the clock, retracing steps, checking timestamps, requesting off-the-record surveillance from traffic cams, and even confronting a friendly tech analyst at City Impound, who finally admitted that Officer Walsh had accessed Elise's car under the guise of evidence validation while Elise was still in custody. Gillian prepared a legal counterstrike of full motion, demanding a cease and desist on any public claims about Elise's involvement in criminal activity, backed by Monroe's evidence log, the tech analyst's statement, and the glaring inconsistencies in the chain of custody. It wasn't enough to exonerate her completely, but it was enough to force the department to slow their attack. Still, the damage was growing by the hour. By day 5, Elise's face was splashed across national news outlets, now dubbed the double-crossing captain. Anchors asked whether she was part of the cartel all along. A former police commissioner speculated on live TV that she might have orchestrated the sting as a cover to eliminate rivals. Protesters appeared outside the precinct, demanding her arrest. Her landlord served her an eviction notice. Even her sister, a school principal in San Diego, received hate mail. But Elise stayed focused. Anger and fear had become fuel. She didn't have the luxury of breaking. Not yet. At midnight, she sat in Monroe's apartment, staring at a wall of pinned photos, maps, printouts, and records. In the center, a blurry surveillance image of a shipping container marked with the red tide symbol. Below it, the newly planted evidence from her SUV. To the right, A printed disciplinary record showing Officer Kendra Walsh had once been cited for fabricating probable cause, an incident quietly sealed under internal resolution. Elise drew a red circle around Walsh's photo. "They want a story," she said. "So let's give them a better one." Monroe glanced at her. "You sure you're ready for this? I'm not trying to survive anymore," she said. "I'm going to win." And just like that, Elise Monroe, suspended, framed, humiliated, rose from the ashes of their lies and began writing her own truth. This story's not over. Click like, share this video, and subscribe for part 4. You won't believe what's coming next. The walls of the holding cell were silent, but Elise Monroe could hear the system breathing through them. It had been 8 days since the heroin was planted in her SUV, 7 since the forged bank statements appeared, 6 since the internal affairs memo leaked to the media, claiming she was under federal review for suspected cartel entanglements. And now, Elise sat inside a cold gray cell on the 2nd floor of the Pacific Harbor Detention Wing. No phone, no legal access, and no rights the department felt obligated to honor. Her tribunal hearing was scheduled for the following morning, but Elise knew better than to wait in peace. She had been in enough rooms with crooked cops to recognize the quiet before the strike. Wexler was behind this. He had pulled the strings on the arrest, planted the evidence, manipulated the narrative. And now, after all his manufactured chaos, he wanted the cleanup complete. And for Wexler, cleanup was never just procedural. That night, the hallway lights dimmed at exactly 11 o'clock. Elise had counted the shift changes carefully. The detention unit usually ran on rigid schedules, but tonight, something was off. At 11:17, she noticed the guard who typically checked her cell every 30 minutes had not returned. The clock ticked forward. 11:22. Then 11:25. The sound came fast, a metallic scrape against the lock. Elise rose from the bench. 3 masked figures in black tactical gear burst through the door. No insignia, no badges, no names, just brutality. She didn't have time to brace. The first blow struck her cheekbone like a hammer. Her knees buckled. Another strike slammed into her ribs, then her jaw. The smallest of the 3 drove a knee into her abdomen as the largest held her arms behind her back, wrenching her shoulder until it popped. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their fists did the talking. Elise tasted blood by the 3rd punch. She lost count after the 7th. They dragged her against the concrete wall and slammed her head hard enough to blur her vision. Every hit was a message. Every kick a declaration. You don't get to survive this. You don't get to win. And yet, she did. Not because the beating stopped, because they stopped. One of the men checked his watch, cursed, and pulled the others back. Elise, barely conscious, slumped to the floor like a broken branch. Her breathing was shallow, her face swollen beyond recognition, but her spirit, though battered, was still there. When the cell door slammed shut again, silence returned, but this time, Elise didn't hear the system breathing. She heard it choking. The next morning, she woke in a hospital ward inside the same building. No outside EMTs, no external reports. The nurse, stiff and silent, refused to answer her questions. She wasn't given a mirror, but she could feel her injuries. Fractured rib, dislocated shoulder, deep bruises across her face and back. Her left eye was swollen shut. But still, she asked for her lawyer. "Not today," the nurse replied coldly. Gillian Cross arrived anyway because she always did. It took 5 hours, 2 legal threats, and a court order to get her inside the building. But when she finally entered Elise's hospital room, the air changed. Gillian's jaw clenched the moment she saw her friend. This is attempted murder," she whispered. Elise tried to smile, but it came out crooked. Tell that to the cameras that weren't recording. That was the other thing. No security footage. Not in the hallway. Not in the cell. All logs for that hour mysteriously corrupted. Elise had demanded the footage. Gillian had filed formal motions, but all they received were vague technical reports about malfunctions and overloaded drives. Monroe checked the hardware himself, what little he was allowed to inspect. Wiped, he told Elise bluntly. Not damaged. Deliberately scrubbed. Whoever did this covered their tracks like professionals. Elise knew what that meant. These weren't rogue officers acting out of anger. These were trained enforcers loyal to Wexler, executing a warning the only way corruption knows how, through pain. By the time she was discharged, 5 days later, the department had released a brief public statement claiming Elise had fallen during a brief altercation with another detainee. No names, no charges, no internal review. Her assault was officially labeled a minor incident, and the media, they ran with it. Talk radio said she picked a fight. Local tabloids speculated she staged the beating for sympathy. The public, once outraged by her arrest, had now turned divided. Some still believed her. Others didn't know what to believe anymore. That was the real damage, the erosion of truth. Not the bruises, but the doubt. But Elise wasn't finished. From her hospital bed, she began rebuilding. She called in favors from retired officers she once mentored. She reached out to a journalist in Los Angeles who owed her a favor. And most of all, she poured her remaining strength into coordinating with Monroe and Gillian to track the shadows who had access to the cell block, who controlled the cameras, who signed off on the altered reports. What they found, though circumstantial, was damning. The 3-hour blackout on the surveillance logs matched a window when the deputy chief's personal security consultant, a man named Vincent Cole, had access to the building. Cole wasn't on payroll, but he had a long, silent history of doing Wexler's dirty work. "We find Cole," Elise told Monroe, voice hoarse from bruised ribs. "We find the chain." And then what he asked. Elise's eyes, one swollen shut, burned with fire. "Then we rip it apart." She knew the system would never apologize. It would never admit what it had done to her. But she could still expose it, and that was enough to keep her going. That night, in the quiet of her recovery room, Elise whispered to herself, "You're not going to kill me behind closed doors. I'm going to drag you into the light." And that's exactly what she set out to do. If you've made it this far, you're starting to understand this isn't just about one woman. It's about all the systems built to destroy her. Like this video, share it, and subscribe for part 5. The reckoning is coming. The bruises had faded, but Elise Monroe's war had only just begun. 2 weeks after the assault in her cell, an attack carried out by masked officers and buried beneath falsified reports and erased footage, Elise no longer looked like a victim. The swelling had receded. The fractures were healing. But beneath the surface, something far more dangerous had settled into place: clarity. They had tried to break her, but they hadn't finished the job. And now, Elise had a new objective, not just to survive the corruption, but to destroy it one lie at a time. She and Detective Elise Monroe had kept working through the nights, piecing together names, dates, and records like a forensic jigsaw puzzle. But it wasn't enough to suspect Wexler. It wasn't enough to expose the cover-up, the planted heroin, or the fake financial records. Elise needed something undeniable, something the world couldn't look away from. That break came on a humid Thursday night, just after 10 o'clock, in an abandoned records office 2 blocks from Pacific Harbor's old district headquarters. The place had been shuttered for almost 5 years. But Monroe knew a way in. It was quiet, dust-choked, and forgotten by time, which made it perfect. Monroe opened the padlock with a click and led Elise through the darkness with a flashlight. "There's an archive server down here that never got disconnected," he whispered. "No one thought it mattered after we moved buildings." "But it was connected to Wexler's old department line?" Elise asked, following close behind. "Yup, voice-activated memos, staff meeting recordings, even call audits. If he ever slipped. We'll find it here." They reached a rusted door. Monroe pried it open and stepped inside. The smell of mildew and warm wiring filled the air. Against the back wall sat a beige server tower, humming faintly beneath a tarp. They powered it up. The fan wheezed. The hard drive clicked. A green light blinked on. And then they found it. A folder labeled Op Redeemer, D Chief Briefing. Inside over 20 hours of recorded audio files. Most were mundane security check-ins, patrol reviews, logistics calls. But one file, time-stamped 2 nights after Elise's arrest, stood out. Wexler Final Directive, MP3. Elise's fingers hovered over the trackpad. Then she clicked play. The voice that filled the room was unmistakable. She was never supposed to make it out of the cell. "You understand me. If Monroe walks, we lose the whole corridor, every container, every cover story, every silent partner in City Hall." Another voice, shaky, lower, responded. "But what if she talks Wexler again? Then we bury her. With drugs, with fake money, with rumors. Make her look dirty enough, and no one will care what she says." She wanted to expose Red Tide fine. Let her die with it. Elise sat frozen. It wasn't just a smoking gun, it was a flamethrower. And it didn't just confirm the orders to silence her. It named the cartel. It linked Wexler to the very operation Elise had been investigating. It proved conspiracy, intent, and internal rot. The deputy chief of Pacific Harbor PD had used the police force like his own criminal militia. Monroe leaned forward, stunned. "We leak this, and it's over." Elise shook her head slowly. "Not leak. We ignite." That same night, Elise made a call to Kayla Ross, an award-winning investigative journalist who had spent the last 5 years reporting on corruption, brutality, and broken institutions across California. She had earned Elise's trust during a trafficking case years earlier, and now Elise needed her more than ever. They met in the back booth of a 24-hour diner in East Bay Ridge. Elise wore a hoodie and sunglasses. Monroe stood by the door. Kayla showed up alone, carrying only a voice recorder and a legal pad. "I hope you're sitting down for this," Elise said. The recording spoke for itself. Kayla played it 3 times, once in shock, once in fury, and once in silence. She looked up. "I can go live with this tomorrow. But it won't just hit the city, it'll hit the country." "Good," Elise replied. "Let them all see what's rotting beneath the badge." Kayla leaned forward. "They'll come for you harder. You're already suspended. They'll paint this as retaliation. Say you doctored it." "I'm ready," Elise said calmly. But the city needs to hear it from you. And so they did. By 9 o'clock the next morning, Kayla Ross dropped the bomb. Her podcast, Fault Line, opened with the words, "What you're about to hear is a recording of Deputy Chief Marcus Wexler ordering the silencing of a fellow officer. Her name is Elise Monroe. Her crime, telling the truth." The episode went viral within hours. The recording spread like wildfire, shared on news networks, social media, and morning shows. Hashtags exploded at Justice for Elise. Wexler exposed. Red Tide PD by noon. Pacific Harbor PD was in full lockdown. Protesters gathered outside headquarters. The mayor issued a formal statement calling the recording deeply troubling. A city councilwoman demanded an emergency hearing. And across the nation, pundits began asking, how deep does this corruption go? Elise watched from a safe house outside the city, flanked by Gillian Cross and Moreau. She wasn't celebrating, not yet. This was only the first wave, but it was enough to shift the tide. That evening, Gillian walked in with a printed statement from the Attorney General's office. "They're opening a state investigation," she said. "Full jurisdiction, federal oversight if necessary. They want Wexler. They want the red tide. And they want you to testify." Elise sat quietly for a long moment. Then she looked at them both. "Then let's finish this." She had been framed, beaten, suspended, and nearly destroyed. Now she had the one thing they couldn't erase, and that truth is just beginning to burn. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to know. And don't forget to subscribe, because in part 6, Elise goes back into the fire. And this time, she's not alone. The truth had exploded across the nation like a siren in the dark. Deputy Chief Marcus Wexler's voice, calm, calculated, damning, had exposed the rot Elise Monroe had been trying to root out for nearly a year. Her name was no longer whispered in shame. It was spoken with power. Protesters held signs with her face. Reporters crowded City Hall demanding answers. The mayor publicly called for Wexler's resignation. But even as the tides shifted in her favor, Elise knew the storm wasn't over. Corruption doesn't crumble quietly. It claws, it adapts, and it strikes hardest when it's cornered. With the public demanding action, the department, now under external review, grudgingly reinstated her operational access, though she remained suspended on paper. Elise didn't care about the optics. She cared about justice. And she had one final card to play. The Red Tide cartel had been fractured by the scandal, but not destroyed. Elise had intel names, routes, drop points, all stored in encrypted files recovered from her original sting operation, the one Officer Kendra Walsh had sabotaged with that disastrous arrest. Working closely with Detective Luis Moreau and Federal Task Force Liaison Agent Rebecca Lynn, Elise coordinated a last-ditch strike, a midnight raid on a warehouse near Harbor District 9, where Red Tide was rumored to be preparing a final shipment before vanishing underground. The mission was set for Friday night, just past 1 o'clock in the morning. 12 agents, black ops uniforms, no marked units, silent entry. Elise, despite the bruises that still ached beneath her Kevlar, led the team herself. She refused to watch from the sidelines. As they approached the warehouse, the air was thick with the scent of diesel, salt, and the metallic hum of danger. The building loomed ahead, weathered steel siding glowing faintly under the moonlight. Elise gave the silent hand signal. The team fanned out. Inside, it was almost too easy. 3 smugglers were caught by surprise. Crates of weapons, narcotics, and falsified passports were seized. A laptop still warm revealed routing details to offshore accounts tied to Wexler's shell companies. Elise moved like a ghost through the shadows, her every instinct alive. They had them. The Red Tide's final hub had fallen. But just as she began to breathe, it happened. A gunshot, not from the smugglers. From behind her. She spun, weapon drawn, but it was too late. A man lay face down on the concrete floor. Blood pooled around his head. His wrists had been zip-tied, execution style. He wasn't a smuggler, he was one of the warehouse workers. Unarmed, barely out of his 20s. And standing over the body were 2 officers from Elise's team, Officer Pike and Officer Vargas. Their faces were cold, controlled. Elise's voice was ice. "What the hell just happened?" Pike shrugged. "He went for a gun." Elise narrowed her eyes. He was restrained. Vargas stepped forward. "You gave the order, Captain!" Elise froze. "What you said to clear the threats, that none of them leave to talk." "No," Elise said, loud now. "That's a lie. That is not what I said." Pike raised a radio to his mouth. "Dispatch, this is Team Bravo. Be advised, suspect down inside warehouse. Officer in charge, Monroe authorized use of deadly force." Elise lunged, put the radio down. But it was done. Within minutes. The scene was crawling with internal affairs officers, federal observers, and department brass. Elise stood in handcuffs again as cameras flashed, and journalists pressed against the warehouse gates. She was taken into custody just before 3 in the morning. The headline was written before sunrise, "Captain Elise Monroe kills surrendered man in botched raid." It was Wexler's final trap, and she had walked right into it. At precinct headquarters, Elise sat in a stark, fluorescent-lit room, wrists bound in the same cold steel that had humiliated her weeks earlier. Across the table sat an internal affairs agent she'd never met, Agent Lisa Wren, flipping through a thick folder like it contained gospel. "There are sworn statements from 2 officers on your team," Wren said without looking up, "claiming you issued a verbal order to execute anyone suspected of talking." The victim was unarmed. No weapon was recovered. "I never said that," Elise replied, voice sharp. "They're lying. We have a body." Wren continued. "We have a gunshot residue test from Officer Vargas that confirms the fatal shot came from his weapon, but he insists he only fired because of your command." Elise gritted her teeth. "And no body cam footage." Wren's lips curled. "Would you believe both units failed mid-operation?" "Of course they did. Of course." Elise stared straight ahead, refusing to let her face betray the rising heat in her chest. She had been so close. The truth about Wexler had been broadcast to millions. The Red Tide cartel was shattered. The raid had been clean until it wasn't. Wexler might be under fire, but his reach hadn't been severed. Not yet. This wasn't just revenge. It was insurance. If Elise could be painted as a rogue, a killer, a liar, then everything she'd revealed could be rebranded as a smokescreen. The death of a restrained suspect gave her enemies the perfect narrative, a disgraced officer trying to salvage her reputation through fabricated recordings and political spectacle. As she sat alone in the cell hours later, replaying the moment the shot rang out, Elise didn't cry. She calculated. She knew this wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about control. And that meant only one thing: she had to take it back. Gillian Cross arrived by noon, her face tight with fury. She carried new evidence audio from one of the smuggler's phones, which had been recording before the shot. The quality was rough, but the words were clear. Pike, you ready to make this stick, Vargas? She'll never see it coming. Jillian slid the transcript across the table. Let's burn them. Elise looked up, bloodied but unbroken. Let's start with fire. They tried to silence her with lies. They tried to bury her with bodies. But Elise Monroe still stands. Like, comment, and subscribe because in Part 7, the reckoning explodes, and nobody escapes clean. The bars couldn't hold her, not because they were weak, but because the truth had become too strong. Elise Monroe sat in her holding cell, eyes fixed on the narrow window high above her. Light streamed through like a warning. Outside, the world believed she had executed a surrendering man during a federal raid. Inside, Elise knew she had been set up again. Pike and Vargas had played their parts perfectly. They'd pulled the trigger, whispered the lie, and painted Elise as a murderer with the stroke of a pen. Now, she was facing a new trial, not just of law, but of legacy. But justice doesn't wait. And neither did Elise. On the third night of her detainment, just after 2 o'clock in the morning, a fire alarm blared across the detention wing. Red lights pulsed. Sprinklers hissed. Chaos reigned. It wasn't a malfunction, it was a signal. Detective Elise Monroe had pulled strings and favors, and with help from attorney Jillian Cross, engineered the impossible. As guards scrambled to contain the fire, Elise found her door electronically unlocked. Her path had been mapped out: hallway, maintenance hatch, service stairwell, then the parking structure. She moved fast, ribs still aching from the last raid, adrenaline pulsing through her veins like wildfire. By 2:15, she was in the back seat of an unmarked sedan, with Monroe at the wheel. "You sure about this?" he asked, not looking back. Elise didn't blink. "We're past sure. I need to end this." Jillian waited at a safe house just outside city limits. She handed Elise a fresh burner phone and a stack of documents intel pulled from the encrypted laptop seized during the last warehouse sting. Within those files was a scheduled exchange, one last smuggling operation, larger than any before, set to take place that very night. Location: an abandoned oil rig floating 13 miles off the Pacific coast. Codename Operation Downfall. Elise's blood ran cold. "They're leaving the country." Jillian nodded. "And they're taking the last of the weapons, drugs, and accounts with them. This is the endgame." Elise turned to Monroe. "Then we're going to crash the party." By 4 o'clock. Elise had donned a tactical suit and boarded a borrowed civilian patrol boat under moonlight. The rig was reachable in just under 40 minutes, an ugly skeleton of steel and rust rising out of the ocean like a forgotten god. No helicopters, no backup, just Elise. A custom rifle, a flash drive with evidence, and a firestorm building in her chest. She arrived just after 4:45. Silence greeted her. No lights, no guards, which meant it was a trap. She climbed the rig's south support ladder, entering through a lower maintenance hatch. Inside, old corridors echoed like a tomb. Elise moved low and silent, sweeping corners, scanning shadows. The air reeked of oil, seawater, and something worse: anticipation. She reached the central deck and spotted them, half a dozen figures offloading crates marked with the red Tide insignia machine guns. Explosives, documents. And there, near the edge, stood Vincent Cole, Wexler's personal enforcer, surrounded by mercenaries dressed in black. Elise raised her weapon, but before she could fire, everything shattered. A flare ignited behind her. Then the bullets started flying. She dove behind a steel crate as gunfire lit the deck. Sparks screamed against metal. One of the mercs shouted, "Target confirmed. Wexler wants her dead or buried." She rolled to cover, returned fire, dropped 2 men in rapid succession. But there were too many. The rig shook as more men emerged. This wasn't just an ambush. It was an execution. And worse, she spotted barrels lining the catwalk red-striped, marked with the international symbol for volatile gas. They were going to blow the rig. They didn't just want her dead. They wanted her erased. Elise ran. She darted across the upper deck, leaping over gaps in the rusted flooring, blood pumping like thunder in her ears. She could hear Cole shouting into a radio. "She's still alive, huh? Detonate if you have to make it look like she triggered it." By 5:10. Elise had reached the control room. She barricaded the door, connected her flash drive to the console, and initiated a satellite transfer. The files, every financial transaction, shipment log, and communication linked to Red Tide and Wexler were uploading to Jillian's cloud server. 70%, 85, 98. Outside, gunfire resumed. She had minutes, maybe seconds. Then the rig groaned, a deep, terrible sound. They had started the countdown. Elise grabbed her drive, smashed the window, and launched herself over the edge of the catwalk into the cold Pacific Sea below, just as the explosion tore the rig apart. Flames ripped into the sky, metal shrieked and twisted. The fire lit the ocean like a sunrise from hell. From a distance, it looked like a disaster caused by desperation. An outlaw officer, consumed by guilt, destroyed the evidence and herself. That's the story Wexler would sell. But he didn't know the file uploaded. He didn't know Elise survived, and he sure as hell didn't know what was coming next. Hours later, soaked, bloodied, and gasping, Elise Monroe washed ashore on a remote beach near Bluff Point. She dragged herself into the dunes, collapsed beneath a piece of driftwood, and whispered into her cracked burner phone, "It's done. Send the files." On the other end, Jillian's voice trembled. "Are you alive?" "Barely," Elise replied. "But so is the truth. They blew up a rig to bury her. They set the ocean on fire to erase the evidence. But Elise Monroe escaped the blaze, and what she carries next will shake the pillars of power. Like, share, subscribe. Because, Part 8. It's the beginning of the end. It started with a single file upload and ended with a nation holding its breath. Just 3 hours after Elise Monroe dragged herself from the Pacific surf, battered and bleeding from the explosion at the oil rig, the truth she had carried through fire began to spread. Louise Moreau, holed up in a secure location with Jillian Cross and a laptop patched into an encrypted federal line. Inserted the flash drive Elise had salvaged, corroded on the edges, but intact. What was inside would make history. The files included everything audio of Deputy Chief Marcus Wexler giving the execution order, financial records tying him to Red Tide smuggling accounts, uncut surveillance footage showing Officer Kendra Walsh planting drugs in Elise's SUV, and time-stamped internal communications proving the entire cover-up had been coordinated from within Pacific Harbor PD's command tier. The content wasn't just damning, it was irrefutable. At 5:27 in the morning, the first drops hit the internet. By 6 o'clock, Kayla Ross released a special Fault Line podcast titled The Monroe Files Inside a Police Empire of Lies. By 6:15, the full 23-minute audio of Wexler's private meeting, where he called for Elise's death and laid out his plan to frame her, was trending on every platform across the country. By 7 o'clock, the first wave of protests began. Thousands took to the streets, young and old, in cities from Pacific Harbor to Atlanta, chanting Elise's name. The hashtags were everywhere. Elise exonerated. Wexler down. Such justice from ashes. News anchors couldn't keep up. Overnight, Elise Monroe transformed from a fugitive accused of murder to a national hero who had survived a conspiracy that reached into every corner of power. The media called it the most explosive exposure of institutional corruption in a generation. And yet, as the world watched with wide eyes and raised fists, Elise herself lay in a hospital bed, hidden deep inside a private care facility under federal protection. Her lungs were still scorched from the rig explosion. Her shoulder was fractured in 2 places. She had suffered second-degree burns down her left arm and across her back. The doctor said she had lost nearly 1 quart of blood, but she was alive. Barely. Jillian sat beside her, holding her hand, tears streaking silently down her face. "You did it," she whispered. "You brought it all down." Elise's eyes, barely open, moved slowly toward the small TV on the wall. It showed live coverage outside Pacific Harbor PD headquarters. Protesters, reporters, riot gear. And just beyond the barrier line, Wexler, being led out in cuffs. Elise didn't smile. She didn't weep. She just exhaled, slow and ragged. That breath said more than words ever could. At 8 o'clock sharp, federal agents arrested Marcus Wexler at his private estate in Del Mar Hills. He didn't resist, didn't speak, just glared into the cameras as agents led him away in silence. Within the hour, 5 other officials were taken into custody, 2 sergeants, a precinct captain, a city comptroller, and a transportation liaison, all tied to red tide, all tied to Elise's frame-up. But not all of them could be caught. Officer Kendra Walsh disappeared just before dawn. Her apartment was abandoned, her badge left behind. Surveillance picked her up boarding a private flight out of Tijuana. She hadn't just fled the city, she'd fled the country. The Department of Justice issued an international warrant within 24 hours, but Elise didn't speak her name again. She had bigger truths to reckon with. By mid-morning, Elise's name was on every channel. A presidential statement called her a symbol of courage in the face of betrayal. A civil rights coalition demanded Pacific Harbor PD be placed under federal receivership. Senatorial candidates quoted her in campaign speeches. A mural of her face began to appear on buildings in 4 different cities. And, through it all, she remained in silence, recovering beneath layers of gauze, fighting back infection, memory, pain. Monroe stayed by her side, delivering updates in a low, steady voice. "You've been cleared," he said one night. "The tribunal is gone. Charges dismissed. You're free." But freedom, Elise knew, didn't feel like it used to. She had lost more than her badge. She had lost brothers in arms, years of trust, and a part of herself that once believed in clean lines and straight roads. Now she saw the world for what it was, fractured and fragile, but worth saving anyway. Jillian entered the room with a stack of letters. "From across the country," she said. "Some from other officers, some from survivors. One from a girl in Brooklyn who says she wants to be you when she grows up." Elise blinked slowly. Tell her to be better. It would be weeks before she could walk again, months before she could lift her arm. But the work had already been done. The truth had shattered the shield, and the woman they tried to silence had become the voice of an entire movement. The Monroe files were downloaded over 10 million times in the first 48 hours. The protests reached 17 cities by the end of the week. Marcus Wexler was indicted on 29 felony charges, including conspiracy, attempted murder, and obstruction of justice. And Elise Monroe. She became more than a name. She became a turning point. Truth can't be burned. Justice doesn't drown. And some voices, when you try to silence them, only get louder. Like, share, subscribe. Because in Part 9, Elise speaks for the first time, and what she says will change everything. The morning air carried the kind of electric stillness that only comes before history changes. It had been exactly 30 days since the Monroe files shattered the Pacific Harbor Police Department. 30 days since Deputy Chief Marcus Wexler was led away in cuffs. 30 days since Elise Monroe, battered and broken, but unyielding, ignited a movement with nothing but truth and a will forged in fire. And now, on the steps of City Hall, with cameras rolling and thousands gathered beneath the rising sun, the city prepared to honor her. A press conference had been called. The mayor was scheduled to announce a sweeping reform bill, new rules on use of force, federal oversight, independent misconduct tribunals, and the Monroe Standard for transparency in law enforcement. Elise was to receive the Presidential Medal of Civil Bravery, a rare recognition awarded only 5 times in U.S. history. She stood at the podium in a tailored navy suit, a sling around her healing left arm, the bruises beneath her skin masked but never forgotten. Her voice was softer now, worn, but still carried the same unwavering strength. "I didn't set out to expose a system," she told the crowd. "I just refused to be buried by it." The applause swelled like a rising wave. Hants of her name, Elise rolled down the city blocks. Flags waved. Reporters scrambled to capture every word. Officers who had once doubted her now stood at attention behind her, heads bowed in respect in the crowd. Jillian Cross held back tears. Luis Moreau stood silently, one hand pressed over his heart. Federal agents, civil rights leaders, even the families of those lost to wrongful policing stood shoulder to shoulder in reverent stillness. But evil, once exposed, doesn't die quietly. It waits, and when the time comes, it returns. In the 30th row, dressed in a faded baseball cap and dark windbreaker, Kendra Walsh raised her arm. The crowd didn't see her at first. The cameras didn't catch the shape beneath her coat. Not until it was too late. The crack of the gunshot sliced through the ceremony like lightning. Elise stumbled. Her eyes went wide for just a second less from the pain than the recognition. She saw the face of the officer who had once thrown her to the ground on Harbor Row, the officer who had lied, betrayed, vanished. Kendra Walsh didn't say a word. She just fired again. The second shot struck Elise just below the ribs. A scream ripped through the crowd. Officers surged forward. Jillian ran. Moreau pushed through people like a tidal wave. Chaos descended in seconds. Elise fell to her knees. She tried to speak, tried to steady herself on the podium, but the blood was already pooling. Walsh turned to run, but didn't make it far. 2 plainclothes agents tackled her to the pavement before she reached the exit barricades. She screamed something no one could understand. Something lost beneath the sirens and sobbing. Luis dropped beside Elise. "Stay with me," he pleaded. "Come on, Captain. Stay with me." Her eyes flickered. Her lips moved. He leaned in, tears streaking down his face. "I'm not afraid," she whispered. Then her gaze turned upward, locked on the morning sky, and Elise Monroe, Captain, truth-teller. Survivor took her final breath in the arms of the city she had saved. The moment rippled across the country like a national wound. Live feeds cut to black. News anchors wept on air. Journalists abandoned scripts. The image Elise collapsed at the base of the podium. Blood staining the marble became etched in the American conscience. Within hours, crowds gathered in silence outside every major police department in the country. Vigils were lit. Streets were renamed. A movement that had begun with whispered doubts now roared with purpose. By the end of the week, the Monroe Justice Reform Act had passed in 3 states. By the end of the month, the federal government enacted sweeping oversight legislation for police departments nationwide, including the creation of the National Civilian Review Board, the Elise Monroe Whistleblower Protection Clause, and the Walsh Ban, prohibiting the rehiring of officers dismissed for misconduct across state lines. Elise's funeral drew over 10,000 mourners. Presidents past and present attended. Her casket was carried not just by officers, but by activists, attorneys, and the very families she had fought for. Her eulogy was delivered by a young girl from Brooklyn, the same one who once wrote that she wanted to be like Elise when she grew up. "Now I just want to be brave," the girl said through tears, like she was. And in time, statues rose in city squares. School scholarships were named in her honor. A monument at the Department of Justice read simply, "Truth has a voice." Her name was Elise Monroe. Some stories end in silence. Hers ended in revolution. She was framed. She was beaten. She was hunted, hated, and nearly erased. And still she stood. Until the moment she fell. Not in defeat, but as a final act of resistance. They killed the woman, but they couldn't kill the truth. If you felt this, share it. Let her name be heard. Like this video. Subscribe for the full story. Because heroes don't always live, but they never, ever die. Elise Monroe's story isn't just a tragedy, it's a mirror. A mirror reflecting the cost of silence, the danger of unchecked power, and the courage it takes to speak the truth when the whole system is designed to bury it. From the moment she was arrested on Harbor Row, stripped of her dignity in front of strangers, to the explosion on that abandoned oil rig, and finally to her last breath on the steps of City Hall, Elise showed us what resilience looks like. But her sacrifice demands more than sympathy. It demands action. In just 30 days, we watched one woman expose a smuggling empire, dismantle a corrupt department, and spark the most significant police reform movement in the last 50 years. But real change doesn't live in headlines, it lives in us, in the conversations we start, in the policies we vote for, in the people we protect. Elise gave everything, not so we could mourn her, but so we could wake up, so that every American citizen, from coast to coast, would remember that justice isn't automatic. It's earned, defended, and sometimes it's paid for in blood. The Monroe Justice Reform Act wasn't passed because politicians suddenly grew a conscience. It passed because you watched, marched, shared, and refused to look away. And if we want to keep that momentum, we have to stay engaged at the local level, at the state level, in every election, and every town hall. No badge should be above the truth. No lie should outlive the person who stood against it. Elise Monroe may be gone, but her story is not over. It lives in the laws that are still being written, the officers who are being held accountable, and the voices rising across this country refusing to be silenced. So if this story moved you, if her sacrifice means something to you, don't let it end here. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who still believes in change. And subscribe to this channel so we can keep bringing you real stories, stories that demand more than just attention, but action. Because Elise's fight was never just hers. It's ours now, and it starts with you.